Hideki, a 5-time gold medalist, one of the most dominant swimmers in the world today, about the cancellation of this year's games. I want to start, though, with our guest for the next half hour, Bill Gates. Mr. Gates and his wife Melinda have been tireless advocates for the poor through their Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They early on gave out $100 million toward efforts around the world to control the coronavirus.
And Bill Gates has also been warning about the threat of a pandemic for years. In 2015, he gave this TED Talk saying that the greatest risk of a global catastrophe wouldn't come from nuclear war, it would come from a highly infectious virus. And he said, quote, "If anything kills over 10 million people in the next few decades, it's most likely to be a highly infectious virus rather than a war." Welcome now to you, Mr. Gates. Thanks so much for joining us.
Good to talk to you.
Bill, in that TED Talk, you pointed out that we invest a lot in being ready for a war or nuclear deterrence, but you said, quote, "We've invested very little in a system to stop an epidemic. We're not ready for the next epidemic." Just big picture, before we get into details, how do you see the coronavirus, where we're at right now in the United States compared to other pandemics the world has faced? Well, I mean, what's the good news? What's the bad news?
Well, this is a terrible pandemic because it spreads human to human in a respiratory way. You can infect somebody when you're still fairly healthy. And there are many things like Ebola that aren't like that. You're flat on your back before you become significantly infectious. So this is kind of the nightmare scenario that in 2015, I gave a Shattuck lecture. I wrote an article with the New England Journal of Medicine and talked about how we needed to invest in new platforms so that we could quickly make diagnostics, make drugs, and make vaccines to stop an epidemic before it got to large numbers.
I know you did some of that investment, but were all the things you called for or hoped would be done, were those done?
Basically, almost none of them. A few countries, our foundation and Wellcome Trust, did fund a vaccine effort called the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation. And some of that work is being used to make the vaccines that will be the first to be ready for coronavirus. But in terms of the testing, the antiviral drugs, not much happened. People, when you don't know that a problem will come around, sometimes people prepare like we prepare for war with war games and putting lots of money into that. But sadly, we've gone long enough without a disease here in the United States that even though we had Ebola and Zika and SARS, not much happened. The countries that really were affected by SARS actually are the ones that have done the best in this epidemic because they acted when the number of cases were still very, very small.
So Bill, when you give a talk like you did in 2015 and then you see what's happening now, I mean, could you have foreseen the rest of this, the sort of response, the lack of infrastructure, the lack of resources, no apparent strategy really out of the gate? Has that part of it surprised you, given that, I mean, you were sounding the alarm 5 years ago?
Well, one of the things I called for is in that the same way we do war games on a regular basis, and we say, okay, we're not ready to deal with surprises, I called for us to do germ games and looked at, okay, who would talk to the private sector? Who would make sure that testing capacity was raised? Who would make sure that the right people are being tested? Not somebody without symptoms getting tested daily, rather medical personnel who have symptoms who really need to know. And so I wouldn't have predicted exactly how slow and how somewhat chaotic the response has been. But if we had done those simulations, we would have seen some of these flaws in the system and behaved a little bit like the countries that have done the best on this one.
It's important to remember that COVID-19 was only first found in humans a little over 3 months ago. It certainly feels like a lot longer than that, given what we're going through. What stage do you think the pandemic is in right now in the United States and globally? And I guess what people at home want to know is how close are we to a peak here in the U.S.?
Well, the good news is that China did their shutdown, and they did it in a very serious way. And after a 6-week period of a shutdown that's more extreme than even the best states in the United States are likely to do, they were able to start opening up again. And the total number of cases there is very, very small. So that's very good news. And as people are developing models, they look at that Chinese data, they look at how the South Korean numbers have gotten under control. So we're entering into a tough period that if we do it right, we'll only have to do it once for 6 to 10 weeks. But we have to do it, it has to be the whole country. We have to raise the level of testing and the prioritization of that testing quite dramatically in order to make sure we go through one shutdown so that we take the medical problem and really stop it before there's a large number of deaths. We do then get an economic problem, which is why you want to minimize the amount of time, and having states go at different things or thinking you can do it county by county, that will not work. The cases will be exponentially growing anywhere you don't have a serious shutdown.
So even because folks look, people who want sort of county by county or say, well, let's get back online faster, say, well, look, in some states there's less than 200 cases. In many states there's less than 200 cases right now. You're saying even in those states, the same kind of shutdown needs to occur?
Well, let's say you have 100 cases, and let's say you don't do a shutdown, then it grows 33% per day. So you take 100, you get 1,000, you get 10,000. It's exponential growth. If you're not stopping it, the sooner you engage in the shutdown, the easier it is to get to that peak. We have not peaked. The parts of the country that aren't shut down, in late April, we should start to see the numbers peak there. They'll still be too high to open up. So you'll probably have to go another month to really get those numbers down. But any part of the country that has cases, and truthfully, because of our problems with testing, because we're not prioritizing testing the right way, that a lot of those places actually do have cases. But even if they have the 100, that will grow, and people do cross county boundaries. And so basically the whole country needs to do what was done in the part of China where they had these infections.
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out again that states that had just a few cases last week have over 1,000 or sometimes 2,000 cases this week, to your point, Bill. The other thing I'm curious about, we keep hearing that the virus is going to dictate the timeline. Dr. Fauci has said that. When you look at this virus, we got 3.5 months worth of data now, 150 countries. If you apply all the analytics that Microsoft, all the analytics that we can possibly apply to this, is how this is going to sort of progress and end knowable? I mean, can you give a clear answer depending on what sort of mitigation measures we have in place?
It's very likely that rich countries who uniformly throughout the country do a serious shutdown, that they will be able to avoid a high percentage of their population getting infected. That's what the exemplars, like some of the work in China and South Korea, are telling us. Now, as you get to poorer countries, the difficulty of doing the isolation, where you live close by in slums, where you have to go out every day to get your food, it is going to be much, much tougher. And so, by summer, I think the rich countries that have been competently led on this will not have to go back into shutdown. And, from the disease point of view, they'll avoid very large numbers of deaths. And so in that phase, we still will have a challenge with the developing countries.
One of the things that Dr. Fauci actually said in our last hour, which really concerned me, and I was asking him about the states that, I think there's more than a dozen or so that have just a 100 or 200 reported cases. He was saying how it's critical that, that those states, that they have testing there, that they test, and that they do contact tracing of all those who are known to be infected, to really, right now, when the numbers are still low, track it all. And then I asked him, he was using a lot of future verbs about things needing to happen or plans. It didn't sound like, I asked him if it was actually happening now. He said it needs to happen a lot more. from what you're saying, it's gotta be happening right now, because if there's not that contact tracing in places where it seems like it hasn't really hit, we're gonna see it hit.
That's right. I mean, we wish that we shut down even sooner in places like New York. Then you would have not had the medical overload that is such a huge challenge for them. Unless you're going to partition the country, the whole country has to be in this together. And we're not, I don't see us making people not cross county lines or something like that. So it really is how many cases are in the country, and have we adopted in terms of testing, testing prioritization, contact tracing, the right things. But the good news is we're seeing that countries that pay that price, which is a gigantic price, then the percentage of Chinese that are infected is like 0.01%. And so now, stores are open there and closed in the rest of the world. I'm not sure you call it good news, but I totally agree with what Dr. Fauci said. He's been a very positive voice about the numbers driving this, and those numbers are very uncertain because of still the disorganization of the testing capacity and where it's directed.
It strikes me that, you know the world of public health very well, and you know the world of the economy very well, financial world very well. They seem to be pitted against each other, and I don't really know much about the financial world at all, but I think there's this idea, Bill, that maybe you can be a little incremental here, right? Yes, we need to listen to the public health guidance and all that, but can we be a little incremental, start getting some things back to work, so that we don't, really devastate the economy that much? How do you respond to that?
Until we get the number of cases in the country down to small numbers where we can be doing testing and isolation against those small numbers, we need to make this our top priority. And it is super painful to drive this very high degree of social isolation I call shutdown. The middle course really isn't there, because it's hard to say, oh, go back to the theater for a week, maybe or maybe not you'll be infected or infecting people. Until we get the certainty we've hit these low numbers, I doubt, even if you told people that they should be buying new houses and cars and hanging out in restaurants, I doubt they're going to want to do that. People want to protect older people, they want to protect their parents, and so the sooner we take this medicine, which is tough medicine, the sooner we'll be out of it and not have to go back into it again.
And just really, I'm sorry, just really quickly, when you say low numbers, are you talking about actual numbers, or are you talking about spread? Because this is a virus that can spread to 2 or 3 people, and that's a lot. If it spreads to just below one person, is that what you're talking about, or are you talking about actual numbers?
Well, the absolute numbers better be pretty low, because you're going to have the testing capacity to take the remaining positives, see them early, and so you're not getting that exponential spread. And that's why looking at the other countries who acted sooner and in some cases did not have to shut down to a full degree, that's where the lessons are. They can show us, okay, what was the medical history? So you see the asymptomatics are spreading. But yes, the absolute numbers are going to have to be fairly low, and we'll have some degree of caution. We won't open up completely overnight, and because we don't want quite the full exponentiation, even off of the small base that we'll get ourselves to.
I don't want to be political in any way, but just in terms of, for folks who are out there, and looking forward, I always think it's better to know just factually what's coming down the pike than it's good to have hopes and aspirations, but it's good also to know what's actually coming down the pike. For people who are believing or imagining that, in middle of April or early April, people are going to be able to gather together in churches for Easter celebrations, or go back to work in a regular way, it sounded like you're saying that's not, you don't believe that's realistic.
No, it's not realistic. The numbers are still going up. that only happens after the numbers have peaked and are going down a lot and getting down to an absolute level. There are some good things happening. The work on a vaccine, although that probably will take 18 months, that's going full speed ahead. Our foundation is funding that. We're looking at getting vaccines to everyone in the world. So in the long run, that is the key thing. We had a really positive result that people were wondering, did you have to have a medical person swab you in this way that they stuck it deep in your nose? We were able to prove, which on Monday the FDA made official, that if you do a self-test where you don't have to have the medical worker with personal protection equipment, that self-test is as accurate as the one where the medical worker gives it. So that means that by self-swabbing, we'll be able to get a lot more tests done and only be limited by the PCR back-end capacity. So there's good news coming. One of the therapeutics, although none of them are proven out, but there are quite a few. We have the foundation created called the Therapeutics Accelerator to really look at thousands of compounds and make sure we focus the human trials on the ones that have the most promise. So, innovation, some of which we could have done in advance, but innovation really is happening. But, when you look at those numbers, the U.S., now with the most cases, there is no state that has gotten to the point where their numbers are flat and are going down. And the testing capacity means we're quite blind to a lot of these cases right now. So it can be done, but we're not, the light is not at the end of the tunnel in terms of a mid-April reopening.
Can I just ask on a personal basis for your family, I assume you guys are self-isolating. What is your life like now compared to what it was, and how long do you think you're going to have to, as a family, live like you're living?
Well, there's some uncertainty about this, but my view has been that through May, unfortunately, the schools will not, are not likely to come back for this year, this school year, and that's about the range, late May, early June, that we'll probably have to be like this. I'm learning how to do digital meetings. I happen to use a thing called Teams for Microsoft, but it's a very different lifestyle, and it's very jarring. It's a scary time. Every morning you get up, you see that number has increased. So, learning to cope is, we're completely in uncharted territory, but the scientists that our foundation gets to fund and work with, they are doing a great job, and the health workers are doing heroic work. So I do see, it coming to an end, and if we do it properly, we'll only be shut down in the U.S. for that one period of time.
I don't know if you saw Sanjay Gupta's tutorial on how to wash your hands, but to me it was a revelation that you have to clean your thumbs separately. That I was unaware of. You probably knew this, Bill.
I'll have to go back and study that.
Okay.
Not separately, but you have to make sure you get your thumbs for sure. A few years ago, Bill, we talked, I don't know if you remember, talked about pandemic flu at that point, and vaccines and how quickly a vaccine could be deployed at that point. And if you did it months faster, you could save a lot of lives in a pandemic flu situation. With this, Dr. Fauci, I think, has been very clear that this is a year, 18 months, whatever, that it will take before people could actually get this vaccine. Are there, and I know that he's right about that, but I'm just wondering, from a technological standpoint, are there ways to speed this up using genetically modified virus or anything to expedite the process?
Well, for the next pandemic, we should be able to make diagnostics very quickly, like hundreds of millions within 2 months. We should be able to scale up antiviral drugs from a much bigger library within like 6 months. And by being ready with this RNA platform, we should be able to make vaccines in more like a year than a year and a half. And so we can, and I think governments this time probably will pay attention to making those investments for the next one. one of the biggest open questions is the therapeutics. Can we very quickly find an antiviral drug that really means the number of people who have to go on the respirator is much lower and cuts that death rate quite a bit? It's tough enough in the U.S. With we put a lot of money into our health system. If you think about this as you get to India, Nigeria, and the even poorer countries in Africa, just imagine what the overload's going to look like there, and yet they won't be able to do that isolation. And so, we as we've gotten the disease down with the low infection rate, we'll have to be not letting people go to those countries or come from those countries hardly at all. It'll be very strict in terms of how that testing is done. So the sooner we solve this on a global basis, the sooner we can go back to the kind of world economy that actually was in very good shape before this came along.
And just to be clear, you think that there will be lessons learned and applied for the next pandemic? It seems sometimes, unless something is smacking us in the face, Bill, that people just don't pay attention, even when it comes to their own individual health, let alone public health.
Well, talk about being smacked in the face. What's going on here is mind-blowing. Never in my lifetime have we had to change our behavior and have this drastic effect on the economy in order to save lives. And, there are people who wish we didn't have to do that. That is fully understandable. This is some very tough medicine, but it's better to take the economic problem where the economy can come back than to allow it to spread throughout the country and take millions of deaths as the price that we have to pay here. And so, I think this is a smack on the head. This will cost trillions of dollars. They just passed a $2 trillion relief bill, and now they're talking about more. The kind of research to be ready for the next pandemic is a tens of billions number. So it'll look almost trivial compared to the price we're paying now. And that price would have been a lot lower if the world was more prepared.
There are a lot of people who don't understand why a vaccine can't be developed sooner. The biggest reason for that is simply science, which is something we can't necessarily change. But you're saying that it could, down the road, get to a place where it would take a year, not a year and a half. Is that after spending the tens of billions you're talking about?
Yeah, the companies like Moderna, CureVac, and Inovio, our foundation has been funding them to build vaccines in a somewhat different way. It's an RNA platform that is very versatile. So the amount you have to change is very small, and you can build up your manufacturing so that it is available no matter what pathogen comes along. That manufacturing capacity is there. And certain elements of how you go through regulatory approval, because you're only changing one small piece, you will have had many of these RNA vaccines approved. People understand the safety profiles. So that would mean that in the future, yes, that timeline is less. Because you want things to be safe, and vaccines actually can, in weird cases, do an enhancement of the disease. You really need to test for that. And so I don't think we'll get much below a year. We'll challenge very smart people to work on that. But the trade-off involved there is about the how confident are you that when you're going out and giving this, that there's no side effects.
I do just want to follow up on something you said, that and I think it's important to point out that as bad as this is, this could be worse in terms of a virus. I mean, you've talked about the potential of a pandemic that wipes out huge percentages of countries' populations, and that is entirely possible. So for anybody who doesn't think that this is reason enough to prepare for the next one, something coming down the pike could be much worse, correct?
That's right. You'll see a lot of people try to show that viruses, their infectivity and how much they kill, the case fatality rate, those are separate things. And so smallpox is a very bad case because it's very infected and it kills like 30%. Here, fortunately, although there's still some uncertainty, the case fatality rate is something like 1%. If you have a medical system that's able to take care of the severe cases, about 1% of those who are infected die. And yes, it could be worse. This is very, very bad, but still not the worst case.
I get a question sort of about how you see the role of the public sector versus the private sector when it comes to something like this, a pandemic, a global issue like this. You were talking about the testing, and there was a press conference at the White House where they had people from these various private diagnostic testing organizations and other, consumer-facing organizations that were private. With something like this, how does that collaboration happen? I mean, should the roles and the responsibilities be more equally, divided or at least described?
Well, the responsibility to take care of the health of the public, that's a governmental responsibility. And so in the case of testing, those companies aren't in a position to decide who should be tested and who shouldn't be tested. Those are societal priorities. So right now, it's fairly chaotic. I said somebody can get a test every day without symptoms, and a medical worker in another location doesn't have access to the test. So the values we have as a society, our understanding of the disease dynamics, and the very finite capacity of the way we're doing the tests now, which is the PCR machines, that is up to the government to get involved with. In this case, state leaders have had to step in and take some responsibility there. But it's kind of unfortunate that we don't have a digital system that's ranking for the finite capacity we have exactly which ones should be taken care of there. And maybe we'll get that fixed or not. Maybe that'll strangely have to be at the state level. But the government is in the role here, and it has to design the system. And then the private sector companies, who own those machines, run those machines, they'll step up, they'll work super hard. The clarity, though, has to come from the federal government.
You talk about vaccines and anticipating a pandemic like this. If you go even one step further back, Bill, and say, I read an article that said that this virus was actually found in bats some time ago. It was a virus of concern for people who were looking for this because it was a coronavirus and there was a concern that it could jump from animals to humans. Do you think that this could have been prevented even earlier on from making that jump?
Well, having these markets where you have, bats in a cage and pangolins and things like that, it's fairly clear that the less we have of those, that somewhat reduces the chance, but it won't reduce it to zero. And so you really do need the preparedness system there. And there's so many coronaviruses in animals, it would not have been possible to say, okay, this is the one to be afraid of. We don't understand enough about that, how it transforms to cross the species barrier. There are literally millions of viruses out in animals. The number that cross over, like the flu does, is not very large, but that's not very easy to predict. There are people who've looked at that, maybe someday, but that's outside of our ability. And so we have to have the tools when it does cross over to see, wow, if you're seeing human-to-human transmission, particularly respiratory transmission, then the world has to go on red alert. And parts of the world went on red alert in January, and parts did not.
You've talked tonight a number of times, you referenced the importance of testing, and I just kind of want to circle back to that because we're hearing from a number of public leaders that they seem to be de-emphasizing and saying, look, we're not going to test the whole country, and and there's now guidelines that if you have symptoms, you probably don't even need to get tested as long as you're not really bad sick. Or very sick, you can stay at home, and if things get worse, then contact a hospital or your doctor. Can you just talk about the role that testing has moving forward? I mean, obviously we know the problems with the tests that existed, we know all that, but just moving forward, how important it is to keep testing, and do you want to, just to get data, is it you just test the people who have symptoms? Do you test people who have no symptoms whatsoever to kind of get some sort of a baseline?
Yeah, for surveillance, you probably do want to go out and almost randomly pick people, even asymptomatics, to see if you're missing something there. And our foundation, with partners in the Seattle area, actually has that going on. We took a flu study that we were doing before and repurposed it. Actually, that flu study was the first to see community spread of coronavirus in the U.S. and should have been a red flag when that was seen. In any case, the testing is very key. The only reason we talk about what you do if you can't get a test is that demand will exceed supply. Even as we get organized with more capacity and we're doing the prioritization, that not everyone will be able to be tested. I mean, people are so concerned now that if you really could test everybody, that would be nice, but we don't have 300 million tests available, even if we're doing the right things. Testing is how you know what's going on. That's where you see those red dots. That is the indicator that will tell you we're not doing enough of a shutdown, or actually now we can start to back off. So testing has to keep going up. Testing is very, very central, but we won't be able to get a test to everybody who just wants that peace of mind, unfortunately. Eventually we may have a strip test that tests for the virus, not for serology. But if it has the right sensitivity, we could have a scale up there. But unfortunately, that's probably 6 to 9 months before we'll have that type of home test.
I know we gotta let you go. Just finally, there's a lot of folks out there tonight watching or been watching this online or whenever tomorrow. What's your message to them? People are scared. People are worried. They've lost their jobs. They don't know how long they're going to be in their homes. What's your message?
Well, it's a very challenging time, and we're all having to make huge changes to our lives that we never would have expected. People are rising to the challenge, figuring out how to be at their home and reduce their contacts. That's really fantastic. People are figuring out how to volunteer, many cases through virtual connections, tutoring and mentoring. People are giving money to philanthropies in the local areas that are stepping up to find where people may not have shelter or food, and that's really fantastic. I'm an optimist. We'll be driven by the numbers, but from what we've seen in other countries, if we do this well and nationwide, these numbers will start to come down, and so there'll be a point, hopefully in 10 weeks or less, where we can start going back to normal. That's a long time, though. It's a wild amount of time, and there will be this temptation to let off. Unfortunately, that will just mean that it lasts longer, or that we have to go back and do that again. So, there's no need to panic, even though the change is a bit scary.
If I could just ask one more thing, because I think your voice is so important here, but there's a lot of people who are watching right now who have not been affected by this, and they're feeling fine. They don't know anybody who's contracted the coronavirus. How do you best convey risk in a situation like this?
Well, if we do the shutdown properly, the percentage of people who get infected will actually be very low. That's the idea, is to not get up to like 1%, which then is 4%, 16%, 64%, if you keep letting it exponentiate that way. So you have to stop well short of that 1%. The damage, there will be a lot of economic damage. Somebody who owns a restaurant, somebody who's now their job is not there. That will have to be created on this new ground, how we do things like relief packages to help out and minimize a lot of that pain. But the medical risk, if we do this thing well, the chance that you're going to get coronavirus and die of it is not super high. There are other diseases that will still be killing more people during this time frame if things are done well. We're really focused on this because we need to change the behavior, to nip it in the bud at modest percentages of the population.
Well, Bill, thank you very much for being with us tonight, and thank you for the work that you and Melinda do all the time. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Great.
Just head.